yours.
Yes, hi everyone, and thank you very much, Marta and Jan, for the invitation to speak and participate in this conference. I'm very sorry to not have met you all in person, but hope that our discussion will establish academic ties for physical meetings in the near future. So in today's talk, I would like to discuss the phenomenon of suicide tourism, which is the subject of my recent book published with the Oxford University Press in 2019. And I will regard this phenomenon as an evolving end-of-life issue, which provides a fascinating opportunity to ask questions about death and dying, and to reflect on their social and political dimensions, thereby extending and going beyond the individualistic perspective which most of the literature focuses on. And now I would like to switch to the PowerPoint presentation that I prepared for this talk. Okay. So unlike most of the relatively few countries which permit assisted suicide in their laws, Switzerland does not disallow, wait a second, I cannot. Sorry. So Switzerland does not disallow this practice from non-residents. And the law in Switzerland permits assisted suicide if made under non-selfish reasons. In contrast to the laws in the US, which are primarily based on the Oregon Death and Dignity Act, specifically requiring that the patient at stake must be a resident of Oregon, the law in Switzerland does not include such a requirement. Moreover, unlike the Dutch law or the law in Luxembourg, the Swiss law does not ask for a continuing relationship to occur between the patient and the prescribing physician. Now, while travel within the US or the Netherlands, or to the Netherlands, Belgium, or Luxembourg for assisted suicide may take place with some difficulty, non-residents can seek assisted suicide in Switzerland relatively easy. This phenomenon is called suicide tourism, although it has attracted much criticism. Now, generally, in recent years, there has been an increase in the number of people traveling to Switzerland for assisted suicide, and the total accompanied suicide also increased, although much slowly. So you can see this in the following graphs. This one represents the number of accompanied suicide with Dignitas, and the other one you can see the increase in the members with the organization Dignitas, which provides most of the services to non-residents coming to Switzerland. But is suicide tourism a moral phenomenon? One would reply and give an affirmative answer to this question if and only if such a phenomenon can be justified on moral grounds. Moreover, if there are stronger moral grounds and arguments to justify it, then oppose it, suicide tourism may also be regarded as morally acceptable phenomenon. Now, the question whether suicide tourism is a moral phenomenon is not only theoretical, but also has practical implications in law, ethics, and public policy. So legally, if one argues that suicide tourism may be permissible and justified, there would be no reason to prosecute subjects of failed suicide attempts or any third parties assisting a person to travel for assisted suicide, including an organization, a medical doctor, a lawyer, a support etc. From a moral or ethical perspective, the argument that suicide tourism can be justified implies or may lead to an analysis exempting health or legal professionals from moral condemnation or ethical condemnation when applying, for example, for information that may support such a request for assisted suicide or an advice and help in carrying out these plans. And on a public policy level, normative support for suicide tourism provides the state with the regulatory authorization on the subject and affects the extent, the content, and the limits of its regulatory power should it exist. In my talk, I discuss and provide the moral basis for a response, for such state response. Whether countries from which people travel to receive aid in dying should shape, regulate, and enforce policies pertaining to such a practice depends on the moral and philosophical justifications for and against suicide tourism. This should be distinguished from the justifications for and against assisted suicide. There is, of course, a connection between the two. One who regards suicide tourism as a morally sound practice will almost certainly also believe that assisted suicide should be permitted. But the opposite is not necessarily true, even when there are good reasons to believe that assisted suicide is morally permissible. This should not automatically lead to the arguments that travel from one state to another for assisted suicide is morally acceptable. So I will now refer to three key arguments in support of the phenomenon of suicide tourism. And these are the arguments from the right to die, the argument from freedom of movement, and the argument from humanitarian aid. So while still subject to some conceptual debate and criticism, and I guess that we will hear about this in this conference a lot, the right to die entails or requires that people should have power to determine the way, time, place they depart from this world. Usually, such a right refers to the concepts of liberty, autonomy, dignity, respect, concern, quality of life, and suffering. Thus, the right to die is supported by the patient's liberty, her autonomy to make final decisions, her desire to maintain her dignity, and the healthcare profession's obligation to guarantee that the patient's dignity is preserved. Furthermore, this right is justified by a shared commitment to respect and to show concern for vulnerable patients and to evaluate and reflect the quality of life considerations, alleviation of pain, and avoidance of suffering. It will be argued that the right to die is so essential to human flourishing and well-being that it should be viewed as a human right, namely that a right that is part of the subclass of moral rights that are said in virtue of their fundamentally importance and essential connection with human well-being to belong equally and unconditionally to all human beings, simply in virtue of their being human. Sorry. Under this argument, a person who regards her life as unworthy and who expresses no wish to continue living in her most fragility. Human frailty derives from conditions of scarcity, disease, and danger. Facing inevitable death is a common feature to all human beings. So the right to die includes all of the major characteristics of human rights. It has a right holder, relevant parties who are assigned responsibility pertaining to it, and a clear scope. It has a pluralistic account referring to the combined values of autonomy, liberty, and human vulnerability. And with relevance to suicide tourism, this is a universal right that does not depend on the existence of a particular society or nation applying to it, to the specific creature who has the potential for normative agency. And it has meaningful and significant norms supporting the high priority placed on it as a human right. So if one accepts the argument from the right to die and from universalism, it follows that a human being should be able to exercise this right to die in another country if her own country limits or otherwise prohibits such an act by, for example, the prohibition of assisted suicide. Hence, suicide tourism can be justified on the ground that it allows and guarantees the human right to die. Moreover, without defending this practice, the human right to die does not receive any practical meaning and instead remains a theoretical level. So in a way, suicide tourism actually guarantees the human right to die. Another justification for suicide tourism concerns the value placed on the moral right to move about freely and its application in the context of access to health, or more specifically to health-related services. The right to freedom of movement underpins one's sense of liberty through the expansion of one's opportunities and insights. It can be argued that allowing people to move to other geographical settings within and outside one's country, according to their wishes and needs, is not only instrumentally important in enabling them to determine as much as possible the circumstances under which they live and die, but it also intrinsically important to their value of autonomy. This is because being confined in one's movement can be experienced as constraint or on freedom of oneself. Other justifications for the moral right to free movement may apply particularly to suicide tourism, insofar as the place of birth is arbitrary and people should not be held to it. A commitment to moral equality of humanity cannot justify limitation of a person's right to freely move from one place to another on the place of birth, also to escape from its laws. On a political and macro level, movement to another country to fulfill one's wishes by escaping the state laws and moral conventions prevents moral homogeneity and promotes diversity and experimentation. So following Albert Hirschman's theory of exit and voice, it may also prompt policy change supported by an increased voice within the country from which the travel is being made. Applying this rationale to suicide tourism can refer to the significance which such a practice may have in its contribution to liberalizing laws on assisted suicide in countries of origin. And finally, if one accepts the World Health Organization's definition of health, referring to the well-being of a person as a major component of health, then accessing services to pursue a person's well-being, including assisted suicide services, may be justified by a person's right to freely and deliberately move from one place to another to receive and to access services that promote her complete health. At a minimum, under these circumstances, a person conditions can, if left to continue, be considered a state worse than death, so that accessing assisted suicide is not contrary to her well-being, and at times may also improve it. And I know this might be a controversial argument, but I think it is well supported. As thus, there is a prima facie moral justification for respecting such a right. Another argument which I developed in my book concerns the arguments from humanitarian aid. And it goes like this: states and perhaps also their citizens, hold a moral obligation to offer international humanitarian aid to their fellow humans when the latter face a state of natural disaster that potentially or actually affects a significant number of people. Traditionally, international aid, which involves the donation of domestic resources, is provided to victims of such disasters as floods, famine, epidemics, earthquakes, etc. Corollary to such an obligation is a person's moral right to receive such an aid, including through being allowed to travel to the donor country to receive it. Providing humanitarian aid is influenced by humanitarian considerations and can be justified as a reaction to human suffering. Countries that consider providing international aid, it is argued, do and should go beyond their own national self-interests. Under this argument, the expression of human nature in international politics requires prudence and moral concern. The moral obligation to offer humanitarian foreign aid is supported by the value of solidarity that applies to all citizens, regardless of territorial limitations. It can be argued that such an obligation could be applied to the situation where people in some parts of the world who suffer from pain or poor quality of life cannot fulfill their right and wish to die due to legal or social limitations. It is contended that such a situation, classified as social disaster, equates to a natural disaster, justifying humanitarian intervention. That a moral obligation is owed by the Swiss people, including Right to Die organizations, who are not only subject to permissive laws on assisted suicide, but are also capable of offering such services to non-residents, can be established by reference to the idea of unreciprocated gift, more generally, as an expression of the power relations between Switzerland and the other countries and their residents. Like any other gift, providing access to assisted suicide to foreign residents establishes both interested and disinterested relationships between Switzerland and the other countries. It allows the former to preserve and perpetuate its image as the oldest neutral country in the world, and by giving to others the means of providing assistance in death, an act which is so widely inaccessible and impermissible, to maintain what Pierre Bourdieu calls symbolic dominion or domination, or a practice that signals and euphemizes social hierarchies. Along with the justifications for and in favor of suicide tourism, one should also consider four major justifications or group of justifications against such a phenomenon. And I will refer to them and discuss them very briefly. So the first one is an argument from consequentialism. One of the strongest arguments against suicide tourism refers to the implications for serious and determinal outcomes raised by such a practice. Allowing people to travel to other places for the purpose of committing suicide may be harmful in cases where ending their lives may be the result of abuse, financial or otherwise, and or does not follow a candid wish to die. If unsuccessful, attempts to commit suicide which are illegal in one's home country may make the people involved behave more immorally and incentivize them to engage in more dangerous, immoral, or even criminal activities. If people who explore traveling to another country for assisted suicide reconsider their decision to commit suicide or are recklessly being assisted, and as a result, their health status worsens, this may aggravate their suffering, extend their terminal condition and the dying process, and create serious financial and emotional burdens for them. As to accompanying persons or partners, it can be argued that these people can be exposed to criminal prosecutions or otherwise social condemnation when they are back in their homeland. While attending suicides of their beloved ones, they may also suffer trauma and feel hurt and guilt for not supporting an opposing position. They may also be exposed to financial pressure and abuse by the Right to Die organizations or other mediators who facilitate the proposed travel or are providing professional help for it. So overall, their close involvement in this experience may make them behave more immorally or engage in dangerous or criminal activities in the future. As to consequential considerations pertaining to third parties and the society at large, these include the so-called slippery slope arguments concerning the detrimental effects that suicide tourism may have on vulnerable people, for example, children, the elderly, patients who lack mental capacity, poor people, and otherwise marginalized people within a society. Specifically, such a practice, it can be argued, will increase disrespect towards these groups of people and increase the case with which ending their lives can be brought about. Validating the practice of suicide tourism may also lead to unethical or legal practices by physicians and caregivers and reconstitution of their professional obligations towards their patients. This will erode patient trust and damage the reputation of the medical profession. On the state level, suicide tourism may hurt the image of the permissive country, for example, Switzerland, and may also affect its relations with countries of origin. Although it may bring some economic growth, it may lead to abuse and illegal activities being performed by its members and expose innocent patients and parties to criminal and immoral behaviors. A second argument, under this second argument, human beings should not enjoy or hold moral right to travel to another country to commit suicide or to be assisted to do so, to pursue their wish in this regard. And therefore, suicide tourism cannot be morally supported or justified. While this argument stems from the more general objections to suicide, it nonetheless holds that the practice of suicide tourism intensifies the conditions under which these objections apply. And there are several aspects to this argument. One aspect concerns the inviolability or sanctity of life and regards the intrinsic value that life has so that it must not be taken by human action. It is argued that the practice of suicide tourism emphasizes the artificial or the unnatural aspect of dying, increasing the involvement of others in the process, including family members, friends, agencies, assisted suicide organizations, professionals, bureaucrats, and from both countries and more. As dying becomes more human-made and dominated by unnatural factors, the value attached to life diminishes, and if at all receives weight only for its instrumental contribution to other external values. The substantial diminution of the value attached to life makes a strong case against the practice of suicide tourism. Another aspect to the opposition to suicide tourism concerns the irrationality of suicide that becomes more evident by the practice of suicide tourism. It is argued that the practice of suicide emphasizes the advanced planning of the act of suicide, including the place, manner, conditions, surroundings, and possible consequences of taking one's life, all of which are dominated by the rules of the market, especially supply and demand of assisted suicide services, operating under the assumption that more and better information results in a better, and from this aspect, a more rationalized outcome. Whether rational autonomous decisions can or cannot pertain to committing suicide, following the concept of humanity or deriving from the content of such decision, suicide tourism cannot be supported morally, as such a practice rests on a heavily making of rational decisions that by themselves cannot stand in a coherent and morally justified relationship with the act of suicide. The third argument concerns the respect for one's body. Under this argument, while suicide tourism empowers one's dominion over the body, as it reflects intimate choices pertaining to one's body, it is through the movement or the travel of such a body that it transforms and annihilates itself. One can argue that a person has a moral duty to respect one's body and to make it function, thereby realizing one's humanity to the full. In this respect, suicide tourism is different to other forms of medical tourism, where the body is altered, fixed, and revitalized, but is not annihilated. If one follows this conceptualization, one would argue against the practice that refers to the traveling body as a means to annihilate the body through the assistance of another person, not just by or as a mere contradiction to morality, but as an act of disrespect towards a person through its body. And the fourth argument involves the nature of dying and the dying process itself. While the physical move from the familiarity of home to a hospital setting transform the person to a patient, with suicide tourism, the dynamic process takes place in a totally unfamiliar, remote, and alien environment, at times even isolated and artificial. It can be argued that the practice of suicide tourism substantially alters the process of dying so that it empties the symbolic and emotional meanings attached to it and depletes the dying person's personality and identity linked to the original and to her original culture. Moreover, accompanying parties are sometimes investigated when they return to their homeland, and thus their experience of the death or the dying of a loved one becomes, from this perspective and from their perspective, of potential criminals. In addition, because suicide tourism involves parties other than physicians, such as those that facilitate the travel and are responsible for administrative, legal, and technical issues, suicide tourism involves financial compensations and give rise to a market, which in turn fosters profit-based motivations amongst the people involved. The travel itself is being regarded as an insurance plan. As this becomes the major characteristics of suicide tourism, dying under this practice is transformed from a humane and incentive-free process to a commercialized, self-interested, and uncaring practice, which is unjustly accessible only to those who can afford it. It is thus argued that because these changes are a threat to human life, which also consists the way we die, suicide tourism should be warned against and cannot be justified. So in this talk, I argued that suicide tourism can be based on moral grounds, and hence it is a phenomenon subject to moral judgment. It will be further argued that while the justification for suicide tourism are powerfully convincing, those against it suffer from theoretical problems, and in some cases cannot necessarily be supported by empirical evidence. Indeed, suicide tourism provides individuals with much freedom and choice in exercising a right to die, which should receive greater weight than in the case within the current moral and legal understandings. The tourism adventure secures an element of escapism from, for example, the physical and psychological effects of chronic or terminal disease, and a sense of achievement following some fantasy over the place, manner, and personnel involved in the dying process. These advantages accord with people's expectations when pursuing suicide and assisted suicide. They also correspond to people's right to free movement, which is more secured and valued in a globalized world, and can also be supported by a revised and more courageous interpretation of the moral duty to provide a humanitarian aid to citizens of less permissive states. Meanwhile, the consequentialist considerations against suicide tourism have not been proven. While there is a little anecdotal and indirect evidence to suggest that cases of suicide tourism involve abuse, there are hardly any cases reporting regret, inclination to be involved in cases of unsuccessful attempts to commit suicide pertaining to main actors and more generally to accompanying members. As to the latter, data suggests that there has not been even a single case of successfully criminal prosecution in any of the countries from which the travel has originated. The only case in which a prosecution was brought against an Italian activist does not seem to have resulted in an actual charge. Moreover, there are some positive affirmations, especially in the UK, following the revised guidelines of the Director of Public Prosecutions, to suggest some degree of legal immunity under such circumstances. So I think the practice just proves the opposite of these, or part of these consequentialist considerations. The argument for moral right to commit suicide should have force if one accords higher moral weight to the right to life than to other competing rights and interests that are associated with and protected by the right to die. Of course, a morally pluralistic society cannot prima facie account for such a hierarchy unless other considerations support such a conclusion. Regarding the critique from the perspective of rationality, people can, as studies show, make perfectly rational decisions to engage irrationally, even if only instrumentally and not necessarily telically, to harm themselves and to bring an end to their lives in accordance with their fundamental interests, including the way they project their future ends. Yet the requirement of rationality is neither a necessary precondition to making suicidal decisions nor a conclusive element in realizing such decisions. Moreover, it could be argued that suicide tourism does not necessarily make suicidal decisions more rational, as these are prone to market failures, I would quote, deriving from the complexity associated with the decision to commit suicide, as well as the emotional burden associated with such decisions. With regard to the argument from the human body, it should be emphasized that the moral duty towards the body, one's body, if it exists, depends upon the functionality of the body or body parts and its contribution to self-preservation. However, when the body or the body parts becomes a threat to one's life, even Kant would have argued or would have regarded such a case as an exception to maintaining the duty not to mutilate oneself. Finally, the argument as to the nature of dying does not necessarily lead to invalidation of suicide tourism, but at most it can offer a new or a revised way of understanding and conceptualizing the dying process and more generally the concept of death. As this session illuminates, and with the other keynote speakers, it may suggest a new form of tourism to which Miller and Gonzalez called or referred to as dark tourism, namely the travel to sites linked with death and tragedy, or sites where death and suffering has occurred or been memorialized. Moreover, commercialization of death and dying is being observed not only with regard to suicide tourism, but with other social phenomenon whereby society enters a death-deriding age, under which, as argued by Palgary and Walter, death is mocked, commercialized, or sold for the sake of art or entertainment, and is being industrialized through business in various procedures, such as hardware, real estate, funeral, or cryogenic services. In addition, one can argue that in suicide tourism cases, the commodification of death and dying involve a demedicalization of assisted death, thus revealing the true nature of the tourism experience. It thus follows, and I conclude, that there are good reasons to morally justify and protect a prima facie position in favor of the phenomenon of suicide tourism. Regardless of being morally permissible, one must examine further whether such a phenomenon is legally valid and what justification, if at all, have in interfering with suicide. The state has in interfering with suicide tourism. This is done in other parts of the book. Now, I would like to finish and complete this, this talk by reflecting on 4 questions that this analysis, I think, leads to. And I would suggest deliberating on them during this conference. So the first question is, what is exactly the right to die? Sometimes also referred to as the right to die with dignity. Is it a human right, as I make in one of my arguments? What values does it seek to protect? What is the relationship between such a right and the right to health care? The second question is, to what extent is the state justified in interfering with people's right to die by, for example, legislation or prosecution guidelines, enforcement of domestic law on access within and outside one's own country, and so forth? Is it a matter of state prerogative, or are there universal norms that states should abide to? A third question, what do people most care about in their dying process? Is it the exercise of autonomy? Is it suffering minimum pain, or securing a safe and quick death? Within this process, do they seek to die with their beloved ones in their homeland, or are these romantic myths that we should get rid of? And the fourth question is, should people receive aid in dying? And if so, by whom? And is this really against medical ethics? Do people who bring their life to an end following aid in dying commit suicide? And I know that there is a lot of tension with the terminology here, whether it is actually an act of suicide. And is suicide morally wrong? So these are a lot of questions, and I don't have answer to most of these questions, but I believe that the case of suicide tourism allows us to reconsider the assumptions that underlie these questions and that we all have with regards to many of them. It is hoped that this conference will continue this process and allows us to look at more critically to the way our death and dying are shaped by the society in which we live and take part of. Thank you. And this is, you see above a picture from our university at Haifa, and the picture below is from Tel Aviv, where I live. And that's a reference to the book if you'd like to read more and more of the analysis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you very much, Professor, for a very interesting approach to suicide tourism. And if I may, I would like to ask about the possibility of giving the definition of term assisted suicide for non-selfish reasons, because this term, non-selfish reasons, is specifically important to the moral discourse. And I was thinking if it is possible to define a phenomenon, and if it is possible to define this specific phenomenon, and how we need to understand this term in the context of legal possibilities in Switzerland. Maybe just a quick question, a couple of questions behind your questions, and thank you very much for the photo.
Okay, so again, yeah, I agree that this is a very important question about the relevance of the definition of altruistic reasons, actually. So the idea is that the action of providing assistance or aid in dying should be, or does not have to reflect any intention to lead to the outcome of bringing one's death out of external motives, for example, out of motives that do not relate to the individual. But when I spoke, for example, with the prosecution in Switzerland while being there and doing this empirical study, I realized that this does not necessarily reflect a monetary issue. So, for example, when you see a Dignitas and Eternal Spirit that they charge money for these services, this, according to the prosecution in Switzerland, is not against the definition. So it's still, they still perform an act for non-selfish reasons, even though they charge money for it. And I know that there are some disagreement about the way this was interpreted, but of course this has legal implications. So originally it was promulgated by the law for cases that a husband, for example, kills his wife for mercy reasons, or if a person gets bankrupt or suffers from economic or financial difficulties, and so this might be regarded as, you know, something that is altruistic or unselfish reason. But as I said, if you charge money for it, it doesn't necessarily that it's not altruistic. That's a kind of paradox that one can argue about.
Yes, we
have a question.
We have a question from Professor Kubiak, and she asked you to comment on the distinction between, let's say, artificial dying and dying by natural means, probably in relation to suicide tourism, and maybe we can precise this question a little bit, because sometimes we can see, let's say, tourism from the countries where people, for instance, little infants are in the situation that the treatment is going to be withdrawn by medical team and medical specialists. For instance, in Great Britain, there was such a case, and the parents are offered life-sustaining therapy, for instance, in Italy. But we know that Italy is such a country where you cannot easily give up life-sustaining treatment. So could you comment, for instance, on the situation that someone is in Italy and doesn't want to be put on the respirator anymore and just want to move to any other country when you can stop life-sustaining treatment?
So, of course, this phenomena actually justifies or provides some kind of a solution for all these cases where people live in societies that don't regard assisted suicide as something permissible, or even the withdrawal of life-saving treatment. But the question is, what happens, for example, when the person's family returns back home, whether they are being prosecuted, and this is something that I also analyzed, whether they have some risks, legal risk and social condemnation. And another important question is whether these phenomena actually triggers liberalization of laws in domestic countries. For example, I know that in Italy, you mentioned Italy, that we experienced some changes in recent years in the way that society and also lawmaking approaches death and dying, okay? Acknowledging more the right to autonomy, etc. And in my book, and I also examine the effect, whether such a phenomenon where people travel because they cannot receive these services, services of aid dying at home, whether this phenomena actually improves in a way or liberalizes domestic law or domestic thinking about these issues, or it just provides the opposite, like we see, for example, in Germany. Germany is a country from where most people travel to Switzerland to receive assisted suicide, and there the processes were that there was a new law prohibiting assisted suicide, okay? So in a way, it can also trigger the opposite direction, to the opposite direction.
And we also have one more comment and a question from Professor Knox, tomorrow's panelist. Maybe I can read it to you. Thank you very much for an interesting talk. Reference to human rights in particularly interesting in regards to the issue of right to die. I have a comment more than a question. Several people have brought court proceedings to challenge national laws, referring to freedom from torture and for inhuman and degrading treatment, as well as the individual right to privacy, Articles 3 and 8 in the European Convention on Human Rights. I wonder if you are familiar with the case of Diane Pretty, a terminally ill British woman suffering from a motor neuron disease that left her paralyzed from the neck down. She wanted her husband to help her die and believed that she had a right to choose the time and manner of her death. She lost her case at the European Court of Human Rights in 2002. I'm sure there are more cases. And also I can tell you that Professor Gording commented on your lecture, and he says, very interesting talk by Daniel. I have to leave now. My wife has planned some birthday activities. Thank you so much for the invitation. And yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. And I guess, I mean, the Diane Pretty case that was mentioned now, but there are also other cases. They also trigger, because of this phenomenon, when people wanted to receive, for example, some kind of a guarantee from the government that they will not be prosecuted if they assist a family member when they return back home. So again, we can see the influence of such a phenomenon on domestic laws, on the administration of these laws. And it's a very complex and very interesting phenomenon that, as we saw it, for example, in abortion tourism, but of course it changes the way we regard the dying process, and this is much reflected in the analysis. Yes.
Okay. Yes. Thank you very much. I see that we don't have any further questions.
With Professor Gordon, yeah.
Yes. I want to take this opportunity to encourage all the panelists to use the Q&A section and ask questions to our panelists. Right now, we don't want to hold you any longer. We know that right now Israel is going under lockdown, so you can safely head your shelter. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.